Hey guys, hope everyone is doing well. Welcome to History 1700. I wasn't hoping to have a lecture done this way today, but unfortunately, things happen. I had some family obligations come up, so today I am coming to you virtually. So you get to see me on the big wall in the room. Um, and I hope today everything goes well. Hopefully there's no technical difficulties. Hope you guys be able to watch the whole lecture. But let's just go ahead and dive into it. So today, just a reminder, you should be turning in your um uh uh, uh my gosh, your document analysis paper number 4, which is on FDR's For Freedom speech. So as always, just please give those to Kabor. He can put that in the box, and then make sure that gets to Thomas so that can be uploaded to me so I can grade those. Just as a reminder again, as of right now, everyone is passing this course. Okay, every single one of you is passing this course. None of you have any reason for concern. I've seen significant improvement when it comes to your papers, to your quizzes. Everyone is doing exceptionally well in this class. So if there's any concern about that, um, I can make sure to just double check grades next time before I come, and I can tell you what your exact grade is. But again, as long as you're doing the work, as long as you're following the instructions and doing well enough on the quiz, and then I grade on a curve, you'll be fine. You'll pass this class with flying colors. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I know some of you may correct me. It's fine. I believe I had you read chapters, I want to say 18 and 19 for your reading assignment. So for next time, I want you to read chapters 20 and 21. 20 and 21. And the next time I'll also give a quiz as well. Um, I'll give a quiz as well. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. So next time I'll be giving a quiz. I believe it will be quiz number 4. I know it doesn't exactly line up with the syllabus, but it's fine. So I'll be giving quiz number 4, and that will be on chapters 17, 18, and 19. Okay, so if you want to make sure that you are prepared for that, go ahead and reread those chapters, 17, 18, and 19 again, just same as last time. There'll be 4 questions from each chapter. So yeah, we'll just so that's what you can expect for next time. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the lecture. I'll try to make sure to spend enough time on each slide, especially the ones that have lots of information on them, so you can take notes as we're going through, but let's go ahead and dive into it. Let me pull this up. All right, so today we're going to be talking about, again, the last 2 lectures and then this lecture as well. Kind of interesting enough, they all there's a lot of overlapping going on, which kind of shows you again that when we're talking about certain eras in American history, there's not like distinct dates or years where like you can separate things, right? There's some debate about when exactly did Reconstruction begin and end. Same even with the Civil War. Like when can we say the Civil War actually began? When did we say the Revolution really began? When did we say the Gilded Age or the Progressive Era or uh the New Deal era, right? Or the Civil Rights Movement, right? There's always a little bit of flux when we're talking about different dates. But the dates we're going to be talking about specifically go from 1898 to 1920, talking about America's rise as an imperial power, or another way people would put it, as a world power, right? We go from being kind of a regional power in the Western Hemisphere, to an economic giant, to eventually a military giant, right? To we put forward military might on the international stage. We have colonies overseas that are comparable to other European nations, right? We're still not the most powerful, right? I should say powerful country in the world yet, right? But we're getting there, right? We're increasing in might and in power, in economic power, military power, and so as we'll see, this is when America really begins to shape itself into what we know as America being today. Right? Some people claim that America, no, is not an empire. In many ways, yes, it is, right? And even though there is some debate about what exactly an empire is, um, about what, sorry, sorry, one second. I lost my note. There is some debate about exactly what an empire is. But again, we can see from this kind of like how America essentially does become an empire. Okay. All right. So, at the same time, obviously, part of the reason why there is American expansion is because there's also European colonial expansion going on as well. Um, the European colonial expansion we're seeing primarily happening in Africa and Asia. There's also some happening in the Pacific Islands as well. But America decides that it's going to assert its dominance primarily in the Western Hemisphere, also in the Pacific as well, in places that it feels where it can best influence and access international markets. And so it really begins in 1867 with something called Seward's Folly. So William Seward, he was the Secretary of State to Abraham Lincoln and then later to Andrew Johnson. And he decides he's going to approach the Russian government um, during Johnson's presidency and say, "Hey, how would you feel about selling Alaska to us?" Right at this time, Alaska, right? It's a colony of the Russian Empire. The Tsar is rules over this area of the world. Right? There's a few Russian colonies that exist here. Very 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 few, right? The Russians tried to colonize the west coast of what today is Canada and the United States, right? They even got down as far as California, right? There was a fort that was built by Russian settlers in Northern California. It still exists there today. You can actually go visit it. But the Russians were never able to get much of a strong footing in the Western Hemisphere in the Americas. So at this time, right, the Russian government is struggling with internal dissension, and they're wanting to sell off Alaska, right? They're needing some money. They have other things going on within the empire, other wars they're fighting, and so they see this as an opportunity to be able to do this. Now, what was not known at the time, though, is that Alaska is so incredibly rich in natural resources, right? Timber and oil. But many people saw Alaska as nothing but a frozen wasteland, which I guess in some cases it is. But many people called it Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox, right? But what Seward wanted to do was he wanted to be able to market U.S. goods in the world market, right? And it was a little bit difficult to be able to ship things all the way across the Pacific without having this place where ships could stop and they could resupply. They'd be able to refuel. Now, later on, this would actually become the Hawaiian Islands for the United States Navy and for the U.S. economy. But they want to be able to market U.S. goods in the world market, thus increasing the U.S. economy, right? This is after the Civil War. The U.S. economy is still struggling at this time. And so his ideas receive a really, really chilly reception. Eventually, the deal is approved. The United States purchased Alaska for $7.2 million, which is, if in hindsight, is a bargain. It wasn't until 1893 when the GOP gained power in the wake of the Panic of 1893, then many people began to say, "Oh, actually, you know what? This is a really, really great place to make some money," right? At this time, you figure out that there's actually gold in this area, right? And there is a huge market. There's a lot of natural resources. We can build military bases here. We can build shipping ports here, right? It's something that really, really ends up being a huge net benefit to the United States. And so what's going on as well at the time with this, part of the reason why colonial expansion is happening is this something called social Darwinism. Right, we talked about a little bit about it last time. Um i believe i believe in the Gilded Age. Well, actually maybe 2 weeks ago we talked about this idea with the social Darwinism. Right, this idea that kind of comes with a little bit of a racial twist. There was a poem that was actually put up by Rudyard Kipling. He was a British poet. Um it's called The White Man's Burden, right? It's the duty of the civilized nations to develop the uncivilized world. Um, and again, it's as we you can obviously tell, right? This is something that is social Darwinism with a racial twist, right? What man should do is that it's all about survival of the fittest, right? Those who are stronger, those who are superior have a right to dominate over those who are lesser than them, right? And we see at this time this idea that because the white race is, gaining ground and gaining prominence, and they are able to basically impose their economic and military might and will on the rest of the world. there's this idea that, oh, we have reached the apex of human civilization. We have a right to impose civilization as we see it upon the rest of the world, right? It's our responsibility and our burden, the white man's burden, to civilize the rest of the world, right? To develop the uncivilized world. This is when you start to see this idea of like a first world and a third world come about. I know it kind of comes about a little bit later after the Cold War, but that's when we start to see this distinction between nations, right? This distinction between the civilized and the uncivilized world. And it often it went along, was in conjunction with colonialism, right? Colonial powers were considered these civilized nations, whereas colonies were uncivilized, right? Places in Africa and Asia, even for the United States, places in the Caribbean, the Hawaiian Islands, in South America, in Alaska, right? It was the white man's burden to bring civilization, right? To bring capitalism and Christianity, economic prosperity, democracy to these places, and that's what they were. That's essentially kind of why colonialism really begins to take off during this time period. Okay, so you see European colonialism really happening in Asia and Africa during this time, as I said before. But another thing that's happening as well is the United States realizes that if it's going to be able to compete on the world stage with these other colonial powers, it needs a really good navy, right? The most powerful navy in the world at this time is the British Empire, right? Hands down, no question. Now, the Germans later on would try to compete with the British, and that's actually a big reason why World War I happens, is because the British and the Germans have such a fierce rivalry against one another that it eventually escalates into World War I. So when the opportunity comes for them to go to war with one another, Britain takes that opportunity to say, we can finally bring Germany down a notch and be able to finally take them off of the board, right? They are so concerned about Germany overtaking Britain that they're willing to do this. Okay, so that's a big reason why World War I happens. But the United States realizes that if they want to be able to compete on the world stage, they need a good navy. This is when you start to see the battleship begin to become an integral part of the U.S. military at this time, and of any good navy, right? So now another reason why expansion is happening is that it even goes back further, was this idea of something called the Monroe Doctrine. So this was presented by President James Monroe in 1823. Now, it was really actually written by his Secretary of State, a man who would become president after him, John Quincy Adams. But it was this idea that the United States would not tolerate European expansion into Latin America. Right. And what this becomes is that later becomes a justification for any American involvement in Latin American affairs, right? Because the United States is saying we're, the big brother here, right? We're going to make sure that no other schoolyard bullies are going to pick on our little brothers, but it's a little bit of a give and take, right? We're going to protect you from the big bad Europeans, but we expect you guys to comply with what we want, right? And so, especially in the 20th century, we see the United States constantly intervening and invading Latin American countries, invading Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Mexico. Um, you know, oh, uh, 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 there are several countries that they invade because, again, the United States believe it's a responsibility to maintain order in the Western Hemisphere, right? That's the duty, or going back to the white man's burden, that's the duty that's been placed upon their shoulders. And so part of that, later, this justification, the Monroe Doctrine would be used to justify the Spanish-American War. And so what had been going on for about 20 years at this point, there had been a revolution that had been ongoing for about 2 decades, up to 1898, where Cuban revolutionaries were trying to overthrow the government that supported Spain, right? The Spanish colonial government. And so there was so much pressure put upon the McKinley administration that eventually they send a battleship, the USS Maine, to Havana Harbor. And there's an incident that happens that eventually leads to the United States declaring war on Spain, and that leads to what's called the Spanish-American War. This is where we get we hear about Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. We hear about the charge up San Juan Hill, right? And there were many people who had not they'd heard about their fathers participating in the Civil War, but they themselves feared that they'd never be able to be in a war themselves. And so there were many people who volunteered because they were excited to be able to go to war. And so let me show you guys a quick video that it kind of explains this event a little bit better. It's an often forgotten war, but it's a very important one as far as understanding um, why did America become this global empire, right? Why did America become such a dominant world power, right? And the Spanish American War is a step towards that. It's a very important step.
Because Cuba was just 90 miles south of Florida, and its population was largely Catholic and included Americans, the United States took an intense interest in the inner workings of that island. In 1895, as Cuba was fighting for its independence from Spain, the tabloid press in America continuously reported the story, often noting the horrors of Spanish repression against Cuba.
And these deeply upset Americans for social reasons, for religious reasons, for political reasons, and also in part for economic reasons. Cuba was an important nearby trading partner. People in the U.S. started increasingly calling for intervention into events in Cuba.
In 1898, President William McKinley decided to send the battleship USS Maine to Cuba to protect Americans and American businesses.
That ship had been sent by McKinley to Havana in January 1898 to protect American interests and also to be there in case Americans needed to evacuate the city. The ship explodes. At the time, everyone thought, and the newspapers reported, that it had been attacked, that it had been bombed by the Spanish. A much later investigation, actually in 1976, confirmed what many people in the Navy, even then, some of them actually thought, which was that it was an internal explosion to the ship itself.
The details may have been murky, but the tabloid press called for a war against Spain. The sensational headlines and thinly reported stories came to be known as yellow journalism, named for the yellow ink used in a cartoon in one of the newspapers, Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. The sensational coverage by the tabloids spread anti-Spain sentiment throughout the United States. At first, President McKinley hesitated to take action, but the pressure to go to war with Spain mounted.
The combination of events and the rolling pattern toward war made war almost inevitable. And immediately after the explosion of the Maine, Congress gives McKinley a unanimous declaration urging him to respond. And a few weeks later, he goes back and asks for a formal declaration of war, and that passes easily in April of 1898.
Soon, the war with Spain escalated beyond the Caribbean and into the Pacific Ocean. Admiral Dewey was ordered to attack the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay in the Philippines, another of Spain's territories. He accomplished this quite easily, only a few weeks after Congress declared war.
The initial war with Spain was a war, in many ways, to liberate Cuba. And only later did it become a war to acquire the Spanish Empire. The Philippines is a turning point in that moment. The U.S. Navy primarily conquers the Philippines quite easily in 1898.
By the end of the war with Spain 6 months later, the United States had control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippine Islands.
Okay. So, I mean, and you may recognize as well that,
February.
you may recognize as well, a couple things in there. You may be thinking to yourself, oh, okay, that's really interesting. You have Cuba, right? That's where we get Guantanamo Bay, right? That's still owned by the United States today. Puerto Rico, right? Puerto Rico is today basically an American colony. The people who live there, it's not a U.S. state, but the people who live there are American citizens. It's a reason why places like New York have such high populations of Puerto Ricans. Okay, and then the Philippines, right? From 1898 until 1946, the Philippines was actually an American colony, and that's the reason why you have so many Filipinos who come over and come to live in the United States. The reason why there's so many Filipinos that live in California today is because of this very reason. Okay, so go ahead and pull this up. Okay, so moving on. And now you can kind of see here, right? The main areas that become possessions of the United States during this time period. Really from 18, I shouldn't say 1898. Really begins in 1867, right? 1867, you have the possession of America comes to possess Alaska, right? That's done through treaty and through purchase. You have Midway Island, that later becomes an important site, an important battle during World War II. You have the Hawaiian Islands, several different islands in the Pacific. Guam, 1898. That's another island, another possession that came into another Spanish colony, actually, that came into an American possession because of the Spanish-American War. You have the Guantanamo U.S. Naval Base, which becomes official in 1903. And then you have the Panama Canal Zone in 1904, right? That's a very interesting story I'm going to talk about here in a minute. The Virgin Islands as well, right? That becomes a possession of the United States in 1917, right? You have the U.S. Virgin Islands. Okay, so one thing I do want to show you guys, though, really quickly. A lot of people don't realize, and the Hawaiian Islands, it's actually really fascinating. I've been to Hawaii one time, and it's such a long flight there, and you have to cross such a vast ocean, right? You forget, one, Hawaii is one of the most geographically isolated places on Earth, first of all. But especially if you're on Oahu, you feel like you're in any other American place, right? If you're in Honolulu, it's like an American city. You have a couple large military bases there. And you tend to forget that you are still in the United States, right? Everyone who is there is an American citizen. They use the US dollar. They have American corporations. It's an American state, has its own unique culture. But I think it is important to understand exactly how did the Hawaiian Islands, which were a sovereign kingdom with their own royalty, how did the Hawaiian Islands become a US state? So before I actually talk about that, I want to talk about a couple of other things really, really quickly. Again, just kind of going over this. So as I said before, Alaska. So you have, called Seward's Folly. Well, William Seward, right? He wants to expand American influence. He wants to gain access to international markets, right? He negotiates with Russia to purchase Alaska for $7.2 million. But Alaska really didn't rise to prominence until the 1890s, when gold was discovered in the Klondike region where the Yukon River is. So after the Depression of 1893, you have Seward's ideas of expansion towards global markets, right? That's what kind of swept Republicans into power, right, with the Panic of 1893. And then William McKinley is elected to the presidency in 1896. Now, during McKinley's administration, this is where you see American territory being greatly expanded during this time. You have them asserting control over much of the Caribbean, the Pacific, right? This is during McKinley's administration that U.S. annexes Hawaii, the Philippines as well. So America annexes Hawaii in 1898, after you have sugar planters there. Many of them are Americans, or descendants of Americans. And the sugar planters who revolt against the queen, Liliuokalani, because she had revoked basically these sweetheart trade deals that these sugar planters had with the United States. Then you have the Spanish-American War. The United States acquires Cuba and the Philippines. And all of this really makes Theodore Roosevelt kind of continue down this path, right? It's with Theodore Roosevelt continuing on this internationalist path during his presidency, and not only expanding territory into the Panama Canal Zone, right, to expand American influence on the international shipping and naval power there, but as well as involving himself in several international events, as I'll talk about here in a minute. But let me show you guys this video about Hawaii so you guys can better understand how exactly did Hawaii become annexed and how did it become a U.S. state. So let me go ahead and pull that up here.
It was January 16, 1895. Two men arrived at Liliuokalani's door, arrested her, and led her to the room where she would be imprisoned. A group had recently seized power and now confiscated her diaries, ransacked her house, claimed her lands, and hid her away. Liliuokalani was Hawaii's queen, and she ruled through one of the most turbulent periods of its history. 75 years earlier, American missionaries first arrived in Hawaii. They quickly amassed power, building businesses and claiming arable land that they transformed into plantations. They worked closely with the Ali'i, or sacred Hawaiian nobility, closely linked to the gods. The Ali'i appointed missionaries to government roles, where they helped establish Hawaii as a sovereign kingdom with a constitutional monarchy. But once certain business opportunities emerged, namely the prospect of exporting sugar to the U.S. tariff-free, some of their descendants shifted positions. They formed a political group known as the Missionary Party and began plotting to annex Hawaii, bringing it under U.S. control. Liliuokalani and her siblings were born into an Ali'i family. In 1874, her brother, Kalakaua, ascended the throne, but 13 years into his reign, the emerging threat crystallized. The Missionary Party called a meeting where an all-white militia surrounded and forced the king to sign new legislation. Later called the Bayonet Constitution, it stripped Native Hawaiians of their rights, diminished the monarchy's power, and ceded control to this group of white businessmen. 4 years later, King Kalakaua died. Heartbroken, Liliuokalani said, by the base ingratitude of the very persons whose fortunes he had made. Prepared to fight, she assumed the throne. Despite death threats and rumors of insurgency, Queen Liliuokalani was determined to restore power to her people, an estimated 2/3 of whom had lost their voting rights. Flooded with requests for change, she authored a new constitution. But before she introduced it, the so-called Committee of Safety, a new organization that consisted of many Missionary Party members, hatched another plot. Under the false pretense that this new constitution endangered American property and lives, they staged a coup on January 17, 1893. More than 160 U.S. Marines marched to the palace, where the Committee of Safety removed Queen Liliuokalani from office. Thousands of Hawaiian people protested, some wearing hatbands reading Aloha Aina, or Love of the Nation. The alleged provisional government declared Hawaii a republic the following year. They proclaimed that Hawaiians couldn't vote or be government employees without signing a new Oath of Allegiance. Many refused. The following year, some of Liliuokalani's supporters attempted a counter-revolution. The Republic responded brutally, jailing hundreds and sentencing 6 people to death. In exchange for their release, the Republic made Liliuokalani sign a document that claimed to relinquish her throne, and they imprisoned her in the palace. Under constant guard, she composed songs expressing her love for her people and began making a patchwork quilt that told the story of her life. While she was only allowed news that had been reviewed by her jailers, her supporters often brought her bouquets from the garden she dedicated to them, wrapped in newspaper. After 8 months, Liliuokalani was placed under house arrest. As soon as it was lifted, she traveled to Washington, D.C. with Hawaiian nationalists and over 20,000 signatures. There, they successfully convinced Congress to halt the Republic's annexation treaty. But the following year, the Spanish-American War began. Seeing Hawaii as a strategic military base, President William McKinley declared it a U.S. territory on July 7, 1898, breaking international law and devastating Queen Liliuokalani and her people. She spent the rest of her life petitioning for the restoration of her lands, Native Hawaiian rights, and national liberation. When she died in 1917, these dreams were unrealized. A member of the group that forced Queen Liliuokalani out of office once declared, "If we are ever to have peace and annexation, the first thing to do is obliterate the past." They failed at this goal. Queen Liliuokalani left a resilient legacy. Her commitment to her land and people never wavered, and many Hawaiians continue to fight in her memory. Speaking of Hawaii's children, Queen Liliuokalani said, "It is for them that I would give the last drop of my blood." Long before Queen Liliuokalani's reign, another queen ruled during turbulence.
Okay, so that's the history of Hawaii. Now, really quickly, before I move back to the PowerPoint, I want to show you guys because I talked a little bit about the Panama Canal Zone. So the question is, how exactly did that happen, right? Why was Theodore Roosevelt so concerned with taking possession of this area, right? Which at the time was actually part of Colombia, the South American nation, right? You have a revolutions going on in Panama, right? You have Panamanians who are wanting to create a separate nation away from Colombia. And so Theodore Roosevelt essentially decides he's not going to, the Colombians won't play ball and help him build a canal. And so he says, okay, I'm just going to get a new government in there that will work with me and help the Panamanians overthrow the Colombian government and create a new nation that will then help us be able to build a canal. So let's go ahead and I'll go ahead and pull that up for you guys here.
In the middle of the 19th century, the California gold rush brought thousands of settlers to America's west coast. But finding gold may have been easier than transporting it back east. The only hope for avoiding a grueling 6-month wagon journey was to travel the narrowest portion of the continent, the 48-kilometer Isthmus of Panama. By 1855, a railroad spanning the region significantly shortened the trip, but unloading and reloading ships at each port cost time and money. To truly connect these two bodies of water, shipping interests needed a canal, a continuous maritime passage through the isthmus. The first attempt at this colossal construction project was taken up in 1881 by French diplomat Ferdinand de Lesseps. De Lesseps had supervised construction of Egypt's Suez Canal, but his success made him overconfident. He insisted on digging the canal at sea level, even though it required boring directly through the Continental Divide mountain range. Futile excavation efforts were buried under constant landslides, and since the diplomat had only visited the site briefly during Panama's dry season, his workers were unprepared for torrential storms, venomous jungle fauna, and tropical diseases. After spending $287 million and losing a staggering 22,000 lives, the French abandoned the project. The United States had been considering building a canal through Nicaragua, but at this point, the chance to succeed where France failed was tempting. Panamanian leaders were also eager to complete a canal which would bring their country business and prestige. However, Panama was still a part of Colombia at the time, and the country was stalling negotiations with the U.S. Sensing an opportunity, President Teddy Roosevelt went straight to the Panamanians. With encouragement and military support from the U.S., Panama launched a coup in 1903. Within days, they became an independent nation and signed a treaty to begin construction of the canal. Just over a decade after the French left, the Americans were ready to dig in, and they were determined to avoid their predecessors' mistakes. Instead of cutting the mountain down to sea level, they would raise the sea up the mountain. The plan was to build massive steel gates, separating the canal into multiple chambers with different water levels. As a ship passed through, each successive gate would open, lowering the water level in the next chamber, while raising the ship and allowing it to move on. The design called for 5 of these so-called canal locks, 3 on the Atlantic side and 2 on the Pacific, raising traversing ships 26 meters above sea level. Operating this lock system would require a massive reservoir of water, and fortunately, the low-lying Chagres River Valley provided a natural solution. By building a dam across the gap where the river flowed out to sea, the entire valley could be flooded. At 32 meters high and over 800 meters wide, the Gatun Dam would be larger than any built before. With this innovative plan, the Americans didn't need to excavate the entire mountain. but rather just the pathway for the canal itself. Still, the work was staggering. Even after progress made by the French, it took over 9 years for 24,000 workers to blow up, shovel, and drill out the Culebra Cut, a roughly 14-kilometer passageway through the Continental Divide. The railway, now upgraded and rerouted to follow the canal, carted away over 76 million cubic meters of excavated rock to be used at the Gatun Dam site. Construction was only half the battle. Leading army officials struggled to maintain infrastructure and sanitation, but accidents and diseases took the lives of 5,000 workers, mostly Black Caribbean migrants. Then, in the fall of 1913, the moment finally came. A telegraph signal from President Woodrow Wilson triggered a dike explosion, flooding the Culebra Cut and joining the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Today, nearly 14,000 vessels travel through the isthmus annually, each in under 12 hours. The canal remains Panama's chief source of revenue, and since the country gained ownership of the passage in 1999, it has also become a source of national pride. While the French began building the Panama Canal,
So that is the Panama Canal, which, as it said before, right, it was in U.S. possession until 1999. Okay. Okay. All right, moving on. So I talked a little bit about the Monroe Doctrine, right? How that became a justification for intervention in Latin America, like in different Latin American countries. So if you look at the list here, and you can kind of see like the number that corresponds with where this invasion happened, or should intervention or invasion, whatever you want to call it. So the first one I have here, right, is a border dispute, specifically between Venezuela and British Guiana, right, which, interestingly enough, I don't know how closely you guys can follow the news, but there's actually, even today in 2024, border disputes that are still actually going on between Guyana and Venezuela. But again, that's something that was going on this time. So the United States intervenes in a border dispute between these two nations, to be able to avoid Venezuela, and specifically because Guyana was still a British possession, the United States did not want Britain invading a South American nation, right? They were still, using the Monroe Doctrine, saying we don't want European intervention in Latin America specifically, right? So they're going to settle a border dispute to avoid Great Britain and Venezuela going to war. In right, Cuba, right, you have the Spanish-American War, and you have troops occupying Cuba, really from 1898 till about 1922 for different periods of time. In 1903, right, you have the support of the Panamanian Revolution. You have control of the Canal Zone from 1905. Guantanamo Bay begins leasing. The U.S. begins leasing Guantanamo Bay from Cuba, beginning in 1904. In 1914, Veracruz in Mexico is seized by the U.S. Navy. And then in Haiti, there was serious economic there was an economic crisis and also political crisis going on in Haiti. The U.S. government and also many European countries had lent significant amounts of money to Haiti. They had defaulted on many of those debts, and so the United States, again, not wanting European nations to come in and occupy Haiti, the United States says, we're basically going to do it ourselves. Right, we'll make sure that everybody gets their money, so they go in, occupy Haiti, and there are U.S. troops in Haiti from 1915 until 1934. And then the Dominican Republic, again, there was an economic crisis and a political crisis going on. So again, for the purpose of stability and making sure that American businessmen are able to have their interests met and that debts are paid, you have U.S. troops occupying the Dominican Republic from 1916 to 1924. It should be noted as well that during this time, when World War I was actually going on, but before the U.S. actually entered World War I, you have President Woodrow Wilson, who actually sends troops across the U.S.-Mexican border, because you have the Mexican Revolution that began in 1911, and you have this bandito named Pancho Villa, who actually crosses the U.S. border and raids a town in New Mexico, killing American citizens. And so you have President Woodrow Wilson, who sends troops after Pancho Villa, but then recalls them once war begins with Germany in World War I. Now this probably one of the more famous political cartoons from this era. It's by William Allen Rogers from 1904, right? And it's showing President Theodore Roosevelt, right, his idea of how he basically has made the Caribbean Sea kind of his plaything, more or less, right? You have one of the ships is debt collector, sheriff, right? We're going to be a debt collector. We're going to be the police, right? We're going to, kind of patrol, make sure, keep the order in the Caribbean. But he sees a huge American involvement in foreign affairs, right? So what this cartoon is portraying is his famous line, to speak softly but carry a big stick, right? That was Roosevelt's foreign policy, essentially, right? You use diplomacy, but you let everyone know that you have the biggest guns. So again, it alludes to his idea of hard diplomacy through an expansion of American power of influence, right? So he oversees the expansion of the U.S. Navy when he's Secretary of the Navy, and then later as president. So in 1906, when he actually wins the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating an end to the Russian-Japanese War that had been going on the previous year. And then he also pushed, as well, as I said before, for Panamanian independence from Colombia, so that he could build the Panama Canal. Okay, now we get to World War I, right? So this is supposed to be the war to end all wars. And a little bit of background about what's going on here. Why exactly did World War I happen? Okay, I'm going to show you guys a couple of videos that explains it in better detail. So go ahead and sit back, relax, and enjoy learning something new. Sorry about that. Hold on one sec.
World War I was an international brutal conflict between 1914 and 1918. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire.
By the way, I know his voice is really annoying, but just still watch it.
Also called the Central Powers, fought against Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, Japan, and the United States, which are the Allied powers. Thanks to new military technologies and the horrors of trench warfare, World War I saw unprecedented levels of carnage and destruction. It ended with the defeat of the Central Powers and the death of more than 16 million people throughout Europe and the world. Tensions had been brewing throughout Europe following Germany's unification and annexation of French territories after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Germany's rise upset the European balance of powers and led to a game of alliances. The spark was struck in Bosnia, where the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire was killed by a Serbian nationalist, struggling to end Austro-Hungarian rule over Bosnia. Austria-Hungary, supported by Germany, blamed the Serbian government for the attack and declared war on Serbia, which was backed by Russia, allied to France. Within a week, World War I unfolded. Germany's strategy, known as the Schlieffen Plan, was for a war on two fronts against France and Russia. The plan was to rapidly concentrate the bulk of its army in the west to defeat France first, then shift forces to the east before Russia could fully mobilize. In Asia, Japan sided with Britain, seizing German colonies in China and the Pacific. The Ottoman Empire, historic enemy of the Russian Empire, entered the war on the side of Austria-Hungary and Germany, opening fronts in the Middle East for controlling access to oil and the Suez Canal. The German advance penetrated deep into France, closing in on Paris, but was halted at the Battle of the Marne by Franco-British forces. The defeat meant the end of German plans for a quick victory in France. Both sides dug into trenches, and the Western Front was the setting for a 3-year-long war of attrition that saw the first use of chemical weapons and gases. Important World War I battles include Verdun and the Battle of the Somme on the Western Front, and the huge naval battle of Jutland between the German and British fleets in 1916. The recent invention of aviation was first used for observations, then planes were gradually used for bombing and air combat. Around the world, European colonies and British dominions such as India engaged in war. From 1914 to 1916, Russia's army mounted several offensives on the Eastern Front but was unable to break through the German lines. To support geographically isolated Russia, Allied forces tried to open a sea supply route via the Dardanelles Strait, and then later launched a land invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula. Both campaigns failed against Ottoman resistance. Italy, which was initially part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, had stayed neutral until 1915 as it turned against Austria-Hungary to annex new territories. The 12 Italian offensives along the Isonzo River yielded little result. Aspiring to recover Balkan territories, Bulgaria joined the Central Powers in invading Serbia. In the seas, the Royal Navy imposed a naval blockade on Germany, while German submarines were used to sink military and commercial ships supplying the Allies, including those coming from the US. In addition, Britain intercepted and transmitted a German telegram to Mexico offering an alliance against the United States, which decided to go to war in 1917. Russia's lack of advances on the battlefield and economic instability exploded in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which ended Russian involvement in World War I and later led to the creation of the Soviet Union. Although Russia was out of the game and Germany was able to focus on the Western Front, it was unable to achieve quick victory against the Allies before the arrival of US troops. Despite the Ottoman victory at Gallipoli, later defeats and an Arab revolt backed by the British forced the Turks to sign a treaty with the Allies in October 1918. Moreover, Austria-Hungary, dissolving from within due to growing nationalist movements among its diverse population, reached an armistice. Facing dwindling resources on the battlefield and the surrender of its allies, Germany was finally forced to seek an armistice in November 1918, ending World War I. World War I helped spread a severe pandemic called the Spanish flu, strengthened America's economic status, and led to the fall of four large empires. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires were dismantled as nations were created, including Poland, Finland, Turkey, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Germany was forced to cut down its army and pay heavy war reparations, as it was considered the sole responsible for war damages by the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty was considered a humiliation by the German people and laid the groundwork for World War II, despite the creation of the League of Nations that aimed at promoting peace.
Right. So in many ways, right, World War One, reason why it does matter, right? And it's often somewhat overshadowed by World War II, which was a much larger, much deadlier war. But World War I does set the stage for World War II, right? And it really sets the stage for the rest of the 20th century, right? There are conflicts still going on today that are a result of what happened during World War I, probably most prominently the conflict in Israel, which was created out of the Ottoman Empire, out of what's called the British Mandate, because the British take possession of this area and then decide that they're going to create a homeland for the Jewish people, right? And then by 1948, after the Holocaust and World War II, then the State of Israel is created, which then leads to the conflicts that we see today between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Now, there's one thing that I want to go into a little bit more detail about, and I'll show a video here, is exactly why did World War I start, right? Because there's still, even today, there's still debate among historians exactly what was the primary reason why this war started. The truth is, there's not really one correct answer, but if you want to look at the match that lit the flame, right? There was all this kindling, all this brush, everything was ready to be set on fire, but you just needed a match to light everything up, right? And so there was one event in particular, right? The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo in 1914, that leads to the succession of events that would lead to World War I. So let me go ahead and show you guys that video. Give me 1 second. Let me pull this up. Here we go.
Sure, most would say World War I started with a gunshot. But there's a lot more to the story. This is Leopold Loika. He was born on September 17, 1886, in the old Bohemian village of Telsch. Originally a horse wrangler, Leopold moved on to real horsepower when he became Archduke Franz Ferdinand's chauffeur in 1909. Archduke Ferdinand was first in line to the Austro-Hungarian throne, then occupied by Emperor Franz Joseph I. But serving as emperor wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Austria-Hungary wasn't exactly the most popular European country at the time. 1908, the Austro-Hungarian Empire annexes Bosnia. This ticks off Bosnian nationalists who wanted to unify all southern Slavic countries under one government. Tensions are still high in 1914 when Archduke Ferdinand decides to visit Bosnia. If there were any place where Ferdinand were to get got, Sarajevo, Bosnia's capital, would be it. Despite this, Ferdinand decides to drive around Sarajevo with the top down in his limousine. Leopold Loika is driving when, out of the corner of his eye, he spots a small bomb hurtling towards the Archduke and his wife. He slams on the gas and the bomb misses its target. The bomb was thrown by Nedeljko Čebrinović, a member of the young Serbian nationalist movement. There are a few injuries, but Ferdinand and his wife are unharmed. After gathering their bearings, Leopold drives on to a scheduled meet and greet between the Archduke and local officials. The officials want to take the Archduke on a tour of the city, but Ferdinand instead decides he wants to visit the wounded victims from the bomb attack. He gets back into the car with his wife and has Leopold drive off to the hospital. In all fairness to Leopold, he didn't know the exact route. No map, no GPS. He made a mistake and turned onto the wrong street. Unfortunately for Leopold and the rest of Europe, this was the street where Gavrilo Princip, one of the co-conspirators of the earlier assassination attempt, happened to be having a drink. Princip can't believe his luck. He has an opportunity to finish out what he started earlier that day. As the crowd tries to subdue Princip, the Archduke and his wife are left bleeding in the car. One bullet struck the Archduke in the neck, the other his wife in the stomach. Both die within the hour. In response to the assassination of the heir to its crown, Austria-Hungary seeks support from Germany. Germany agrees and Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia, Serbia's ally, mobilizes its forces and as a result, Germany declares war on Russia. Russia's ally, France, then mobilizes its forces, which causes Germany to declare war on France. In turn, Great Britain declares war on Germany. Austria-Hungary then declares war on Russia, Serbia declares war on Germany, and France and Great Britain declare war on Austria-Hungary. The First World War has begun, and all because of a wrong turn.
Well, and it should be noted as well, like, it wasn't just because of a wrong.
Hey, I'm Kayla, and I'm one of the AI voices from Revoicer. I can be sad,
Sorry about that.
and you'll think that
The 14 points.
I want to show that to you guys. I want to show that video to you guys later. Sorry about the ad. And obviously, like, it's more than just a wrong turn, right? What you see happening here is a rise in nationalism. You see, because many people fear Germany's rising influence, right? It's kind of upsetting the balance of power that's existed for a bit since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. That, you know, you see this rise in military alliances happening, right? So that's the reason why, essentially, when one domino falls, everything else falls into place. Kind of going into more detail about what happens here. So the war to end all wars, right? As it says here, right, there's tensions throughout Europe as Austria-Hungary and Russia fight over control over Southeast Europe, right? This area, the Balkans, is you have many Slavic people who live here. You have people who are Slavic nationalists who want to create a unified Slavic state, which eventually does come into existence through Yugoslavia, but then that breaks up in the 90s for a number of reasons. But Russia, who they consider themselves, you know, the protector of the Slavs, they themselves are the Slavs. They kind of view the Serbs and other Slavs, of the Bosnians, the Serbs, kind of as their little brother. And so the Russians are always very, very wary of the Austro-Hungarians, saying, you know, you guys need to take good care of them. Otherwise, if you're picking on them, we're going to come teach you a lesson, right? So when Austria-Hungary invades Serbia, Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary, and Austria-Hungary goes to Germany and says, hey, you know, we've been declared war on, we need you to come to our aid. So Germany declares war on Russia, and then Russia calls to aid to Britain and France. They declare war on Germany, right? And it turns into this whole thing. And so Germany, as it says before, right, they decide that they're going to invade France through Belgium, which was actually a neutral nation. and so, you know, the plan was they were going to quickly defeat the French and then move east to be able to defeat the Russians before they're able to mobilize. Now, America remains neutral for much of the war. You know, part of the reason why is because you do have these large immigrant populations. You have large number of German immigrants and Russian immigrants and Italian immigrants, right? Many people who have family who still lives in Europe. And the question becomes, you know, is it America's interest to get involved in this war? Now, America did kind of align more with the Allies. We were a little bit more warm and friendly towards the Allies. And as we'll see later on, right, Wilson would kind of use this language, right? We need to make the world safe for democracy, right? This is a fight between democracy and authoritarianism. And he would talk about how, like, you know, because the Germans were ruled by the Kaiser, and you know, you have the empire, the Austria-Hungary is ruled by an emperor, and you also have the Ottoman Empire, right? But then it's like, but Britain has a king, and France is an empire, and Russia has a czar. So you can, it's a poor argument, but it's an argument that he uses nonetheless. Okay, so how exactly did America get started in all of this, right? There's a couple of things that happen, right? So even though America has professed neutrality, we actually do increase trade with Britain, and German U-boats, which are basically submarines, right? They began to sink British ships during this time. Even if they are going, you know, going back and forth between the United States. And America starts to get really, really incensed about this because, you know, it's hurting the American economy because they're sinking British ships that are going back and forth. They're trading with the United States. And so there's a really bad incident that happens on May 17th of 1915. You have the British ship, passenger ship, the Lusitania, and there are about 1,200 people killed. 128 of those are Americans. And the United States nearly goes to war at this time with Germany, but Germany, to try, knowing that they can't fight a war with the United States, you know, that will tip the scales, you know, tip the war in the Allies' favor. They decide they're going to, you know, stop sending their U-boats out to sink ships. Now, eventually, though, Germany does go back to this. They go back to what's called unrestricted submarine warfare. And then truly what happened, then the thing that really breaks the camel's back is that there's two things that happen. So in 1917, there's more U.S. ships that are sunk by U-boats, and then there's also something called the Zimmermann Telegram. So at this time, you have the German foreign minister, right? His name is Arthur Zimmermann, and he sends a letter to the Mexican government, basically asking for their support in the war, right? So if Mexico supports Germany, he promises to return Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona for return, right? If we go to war with the United States and you get involved and keep the Americans occupied so they can't come over to Europe, we will help you regain possession of these territories that you lost several decades ago in the Mexican-American War. I mean, right, they lost these territories about 80 years prior to this. And so the note was intercepted, you know, by the U.S., right? And this then further inflamed the American public. All right, so let me show you guys a quick video in regards to that. Sorry, one sec.
So America watches World War I from 1914 to April of 1917. And people ask why. Why doesn't America get involved immediately? And American politicians are petrified of being drawn into a foreign war and fighting for foreign ends.
Remember, the United States is a nation of immigrants. People came here to avoid war in Europe.
The Americans had, from the very beginning, an official policy of neutrality, but neutrality never meant indifference or apathy.
Even though we're saying we don't want to involve ourselves, we certainly were sympathetic in trying to help and aid that cause in ways that the Germans saw as being destructive to their war aims. So in all those ways, the Wilson administration is walking a tightrope.
Woodrow Wilson, after all, runs for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And yet within a year after winning that election, that very same president is declaring war on the Germans.
Ultimately, the triggering event that brings us into the war is Germany's decision to revive unrestricted submarine warfare.
Added to that, the Germans had managed in a particularly ham-fisted way to try and recruit the Mexicans to come in on their side if America entered the war. And they had offered to return to the Mexicans all the lands they had lost in the 19th century to the US, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. The Germans sent this offer to the Mexicans by telegram, Western Union, of all things. Only what they didn't realize was the Western Union office was in London. And so the British captured the telegram and promptly sent it to the US and released it in public. And that angered the American people so much that, combined with unrestricted submarine warfare, Wilson felt that he had to take the US into the war against Germany and Austro-Hungary. When America entered the conflict, it changed the war. Although not as much as everybody expected, because just as America was entering the war, Russia was dropping out.
Now, it's a race. As Russia is leaving the war, can the United States get enough troops in to tilt that scale in favor of the Allies?
They brought in the men, the materiel, and the resources that these allies needed desperately.
The French and the British were suffering a sense that the war was stalemated, that defeat might be coming, and the American commitment was a real shot in the arm for both political leaders and for ordinary soldiers in the trenches.
Prior to the outbreak of World War I, America was recognized as a strong young nation. By joining with the Allies and really helping to bring about the end of the war, we positioned ourselves as one of the world powers for the rest of the century.
Okay. Okay, so hold on, let me pull this back up. 1 second here. Okay, so question becomes now, so war is declared April 6th of 1917, right? The prior year, Wilson had won re-election. He had campaigned on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Of course, the next year, he takes the United States into war. Now, what we see happening here is a mass mobilization of American society, right? I'd say even more so than the Civil War, because what you see happening here is this idea of America, the government directly intervening in the lives of Americans for the purpose of mobilizing them for a single cause, right? Even during the Civil War, that wasn't really possible, right? The federal government wasn't yet quite in a place to do that. That's part of the reason why the war lasted for as long as it did in the 1860s. But we finally see the American government this is the very end of the Progressive Era, this idea of the US government kind of, pushing and socially engineering society for a single purpose, right? Kind of using this idea of communal power to bring about to be able to accomplish this great and significant task, right? So the American people, they're completely immobilized for war effort during this time. So in May of 1917, you have you have the Selective Service Act that's passed, right? You have the beginning of a draft. You also have war bond sales that are going on at this time, right? That's one of the ways that the war is funded. Basically, you buy bonds from the U.S. government, and then the government says that they will eventually pay you back with interest later on. You also have the War Industries Board, which organized industry. Now, the War Industries Boards, or the WIB, what this does is that they set prices, right? So you have price control at this time, right? They allocate scarce materials, right? They boost efficiency to increase production for the war effort. You have Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover would later become the president from 1929 to 1933. The Great Depression would begin under his administration. So you have the Food Administration, right? You'd have people make voluntary pledges, right? You would have meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays. You would have people plant victory gardens, right? People having to grow their own food. You have people increasing agricultural production as well. You also have this idea of the government promoting unity which I'll talk about what unity looked like here in a second. But the CPI, the Committee on Public Information, it basically was the propaganda wing to support the war effort, right? So it created posters, it created movies, editorials to support the war. You also have the Espionage and Sedition Acts that are passed this time as well. Now, the Espionage Act, what exactly did this do, right? It set heavy fines and prison time for anyone who obstructed the war effort. Again, what exactly does it look like? Basically, Uncle Sam right here gets to decide that. And then the Sedition Act, right? You also have penalties for speaking or writing against the draft or bond sales or the war effort in general. So if you go out and protest the war, you could be prosecuted under one of these acts. You could be fined, you could be imprisoned for either refusing to serve in the war, for stopping the sale of bonds, right, to protesting the war, publishing any information critical of the government, right? All of that was something that, many people became weary of the US government kind of after the war, right? They kind of got a glimpse of like, God, we give the government this much power. Are they willing to give it up? Is it really worth it, for the purpose of mobilizing for war? Okay, so this is some of the propaganda material that was created by the CPI, by the Committee on Public Information, right? You have this idea, right? Before Uncle Sam, the symbol of the United States was actually a woman, right? Her name was Columbia. So this was the symbol you'd often see like in the 19th century, even to the early 20th century, right? But it says, be patriotic, sign your country's pledge to save food, right? That was through the Food Administration, right? Wake up, America. Civilization calls every man, woman, and child, right? Again, these propaganda posters to mobilize and to energize and encourage citizens to participate in the war effort. Right. And we see these war posters as well, these ones attacking Germany and trying to make people, be willing to go to war, saying like, this is who our enemy is, right? To beat back the Hun. It was, this derogatory term used for the Germans. Like they were barbaric, right? They beat back the Hun with Liberty Bonds. Look at his like blood-stained fingers and his, gray skin and green eyes to make him look like a monster. You have the Kaiser Wilhelm II, making him look almost like vampiric or rat-like or just demonic, right? Defeat the Kaiser and his U-boats. Victory depends on which fails first, food or frightfulness. Eat less wheat. Right? All this was inspired to scare people, to not to be able to go along with these government programs. Okay, so I want to show you guys a quick video though, kind of what unity actually looked like, right? How the idea of Americanism actually comes about during this time, during this decade, during World War I, of what it means to be an American, and how like 100% Americanism comes into the mind of Americans, right? This idea that you need to completely assimilate into American society and completely, strip yourself of any kind of unique identifier, especially if you are an immigrant. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. So let me pull this up. Here we go.
There were plenty of people who opposed the US entry into the First World War, and they had different reasons. The early 20th century is, in some ways, the peak time for the global peace movement. Many of these pacifists are being motivated by religious sensibilities. Some are motivated by secular reasons. Some are motivated by feminism and a belief that war was a masculine undertaking that women could stand up against and stop. Some of them are motivated by economic arguments, that war is not in the interests of working people or of countries in general.
Entering World War I by 1917 was far from a universally popular idea. In the Midwest, where you had a substantial numbers of German-speaking Americans, they weren't necessarily interested in getting into the war. And in the far West, where you had a large number of Irish Americans who actually still hated the British for the famine in the middle of the 19th century, none of these people are interested in going to war.
And then there were others who opposed U.S. entry into the war, that drew on American labor movement, which argued that war was not in the interests of ordinary working people.
Southerners in general and Midwesterners as well really thought that this was a war that was sponsored by Northeastern industrialists to make more profit.
It's very clear that to keep national unity and to keep industrial production going, that the government will need to suppress those voices.
If you were a member of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, you actually ran the risk of being beaten, lynched, as well as undergoing mob violence. Employers had no reluctance bringing in strikebreakers, state police, National Guardsmen to put down any sort of incipient riot, and I mean put it down violently. Any refusal to follow the lines of the war and be supportive can get you in difficulty.
At the same time that the United States adopts the draft, the same law establishes the right of conscientious objection, in which someone who is drafted tells the government that he cannot serve for religious or other reasons. Over the course of the war, 65,000 men claimed status as conscientious objectors and either refused to serve in the military at all or sought out other forms of service that were in non-combat or civilian roles.
It's pretty hard to convince the authorities in the United States that anyone should object to the war in this frenzy of patriotism that gradually overcomes the country.
Conscientious objectors experienced intimidation, bullying, physical violence, and in some cases, prosecution for refusing to obey military orders.
The last thing you want to do if you're the average citizen is be associated with them in any way, shape, form, or fashion. These people are regarded primarily as a danger to the war effort.
The primary obligation that Americans were told to perform for the government was military service. So citizenship and military service become linked. And this means people who opposed the war found themselves increasingly under scrutiny from their neighbors and in fact from government officials as well. This played out in big ways and small. There were laws on the books which made it a crime to criticize the war or to criticize the government war effort. There was the American Protective League that existed to investigate cases of disloyalty. So ordinary people who had stood up against the war or just criticized how it was being fought could find themselves under legal charges.
For those who objected to the war, they will ultimately be freed from prison in the end, and many of them are able to resume their lives. But the difficulty is you've got a prison record, you are labeled as being unpatriotic, so the consequences could carry on long after the war.
The divisions of the war are sort of papered over, but they don't go away. Soldiers are returning, the economy is in trouble, there's just been a revolution in Russia that brings a socialist government to power. This generates political fear and controversy that culminates in the first Red Scare. As ideas about socialism are spreading throughout Europe, many Americans fear that that's coming to the United States. This generates investigations, raids, deportations of people who opposed the government or took radical positions. So the war ended in November 1918, but peace wouldn't arrive in the United States for some time to come.
And it should be noted as well that patriotism was so heightened during this time. This idea of 100% Americanism, that you have the names of food being changed during this time, the names of towns being changed. Because what many people forget, in fact, the largest ethnic group in the United States, even right now in 2024, are people who actually are descended from German immigrants. Right, like more people in the United States, a plurality of Americans claim that are descended from German immigrants. Right, they are technically ethnic Germans, if you will, even here in the United States. And right, many of those foods, there were several towns in the United States named after German towns like Berlin, Frankfurt. You know, you have towns like in the Midwest that were named Berlin. They had their names changed to Liberty. You have sauerkraut was changed to Liberty cabbage. You have, you have, this is so dumb. You have like Americans who stopped listening to German music. People who had German last names were expected to change their last names to sound more American, more anglicized. You have hamburgers were changed to be called Liberty Steak or Liberty Sandwiches. You have Frankfurters or hot dogs changed to Liberty sausages, right? Even German measles were changed to Liberty measles. German pretzels were removed from lunch counters. Like it was just there was so much heightened tension, and so many people were afraid to to tick off the government that they went above and beyond to try to disassociate themselves from anything affiliated with Germany. Now, one thing that happens after the war, during the peace process, is that Wilson, the US president, goes over to Versailles and he presents something called the 14 points. Okay. Now there are many critics of Wilson, myself included. I could spend the entire time that I'm giving this lecture, I could go on for hours about what an awful president Woodrow Wilson was and what an awful human being he was. I'm not going to do that today, though. I'm going to show you instead this video that talks a little bit more about these 14 points, because it does help us better understand the direction, kind of the vision that Wilson had for American foreign policy, and then what foreign policy for the United States looked like going through into the 20th century, especially after World War II. So let me go ahead and pull this up. One second.
On January 8th, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson delivered his famous 14-point speech, where he outlined a plan to end World War I and secure world peace. When the war broke out in 1914, Wilson adopted a policy of neutrality, with no intention of involving the U.S. in a foreign war. But the U.S. couldn't remain isolated for long. In January 1917, British intelligence intercepted and decoded a message known as the Zimmermann Telegram, in which Germany asked Mexico to ally with them against the United States. Then, on February 1st of the same year, Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare and started sinking merchant and passenger ships with U.S. citizens on board, something they had agreed not to do after sinking the Lusitania in 1915. The Lusitania, a British ocean liner, was torpedoed without warning, leading to the deaths of over 1,100 people, including 128 Americans. This was the final straw. On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went before a joint session of Congress to request a declaration of war against Germany. Just 2 days later, on April 4th, Congress declared war. The war was brutal and expensive. In a little under 2 years of fighting, the U.S. had spent $32 billion and lost over 116,000 men. Wilson wanted the war to end, but when announcing his 14 points in January of 1918, Wilson didn't just want to end the war to protect America, he hoped to prevent wars from ever happening again. So together with his advisor and friend, Colonel Edward M. House, President Wilson organized a group of 150 political and social scientists to study Allied and American policy all over the globe, collecting nearly 2,000 reports and 1,200 maps. This would inform the idealistic 14 points, which would address causes of the World War and also propose solutions to ensure world peace in the future through policy and negotiations. 8 of the 14 points were aimed at resolving specific territorial issues among the countries involved in combat, and securing borders and statehood for Italy, the Turkish part of the Ottoman Empire, Poland, and Austria-Hungary. 5 points covered general principles for a peaceful world: open treaties and agreements, freedom of the seas, free trade, reduction of armaments, and adjustment of colonial claims to land. These were all based on the principles of self-determination, the idea that nations should have the right to govern themselves without interference from other countries. The 14th and most influential point proposed that countries form an alliance to guarantee the political independence and territorial integrity of great and small states alike. The 14-point speech reflected a tradition of diplomatic idealism that would come to define Wilson's presidency. But how did that idealism translate into action? Well, most of Wilson's points were never fully realized. But one point in particular would have a big impact on the Treaty of Versailles and the end of World War I. When the Allies met in Versailles to create a treaty to end the war, they were less interested in Wilson's idealistic vision and more interested in regaining what they had lost and punishing Germany. To Wilson's disappointment, the points were barely integrated, and only to the benefit of the Allies. Most of them weren't actually adopted or honored by anyone after the treaty was signed. However, the 14th point was incorporated, the creation of a world organization providing collective security. This would later be known as the League of Nations. Ironically, despite a campaign from Wilson, the US never actually joined the League of Nations. Wilson foreshadowed that without American membership in the League, there would be another world war within a generation. Sure enough, World War II would break out just 20 years later.
Okay. And I will say, the United States joining the League of Nations was not the only reason why World War II began. Just want to make that point clear. So, okay. So, moving on. So as the video talked about, right? So Wilson's 14-point speech. So eight points, proposed new nations, right? Border changes, self-determined for nations. You also have 5 of the points, right? Kind of talking about more broad principles, the idea of freedom of the seas. This is actually something the United States, really highly values today, right? One of the reasons why the world exists and what some people call the Pax Americana, or the American peace, is because the United States has guaranteed, because we have the largest navy in the world, most powerful navy, is basically free trade, right? Freedom of the seas, right? We ensure that freedom of the sea, free trade can happen. We also promote open diplomacy, right? Reduction of armaments, free trade as well, and then fair settlement of colonial claims as well between these nations. And then finally, the proposed League of Nations, which would come to fruition with the United Nations after World War II. So Wilson's plan is ultimately rejected, again, because of European leaders. European leaders wanted to punish the Germans as severely as possible, because, again, part of the reason why many people believe World War I began was because you had the rise of the German Empire at the end of the 19th century kind of upset the balance of power in Europe. And so you have the British and the Russians and the French who don't want a new Germany rising, right? Because it's just too much for them to handle, essentially, right? So they want to punish Germany to the point that Germany can never rise again. And so you also have the Russian Communist Revolution happening. You have Republicans getting control of Congress in 1918, and then finally the presidency as well in 1920 because of Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge coming to power at that time. Okay, so you have the Treaty of Versailles, right? It's dominated by British and French demands. This creates more international tension, right? Congress eventually rejects this as well. And then the other thing happens as well, it's really, really influential, it's often overlooked, right? So right towards the end of the war, you have the Spanish influenza pandemic happening at this time. So you have soldiers who are returning, right? This greatly increases exposure, right? You have all these soldiers really from all over the world, right? You have many of these colonial soldiers from different parts of the British and French Empire who contract the flu, and they spread it to all parts of the globe. Now, it's actually believed, even though it was called the Spanish flu, most people believe it actually started in the United States. Some of the first reported cases actually came out of Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. There's also some claims that perhaps it began amongst Chinese migrants who lived in boxcars in Canada. We just don't know for sure. Now, the reason why it's called the Spanish flu, though, is because Spain was neutral during the war, and their press was not censored. And so they were reporting on these cases, and many people were saying, pointing the finger of blame at Spain and saying, oh, you guys, this is where the flu started because you guys are reporting on it, even though there were other cases happening in Europe as well. But because they didn't want to decrease morale, many of these warring nations censored their press and would not allow people to report on on this new influenza that was spreading. Right. And so it disproportionately killed people between the ages of 20 to 65. It's believed that there were about 50 million global deaths, about 500,000 in the US. And what it resulted is in strong quarantine mandates and cancellation of schools and other public events. So actually in Utah, so by October 4th, there were only a few cases that were reported in Utah. A week later, it had spread so quickly that it had caused a few deaths. And by the way, sorry, this is October of 1918, October 4th, 1918. So a few weeks later, you have it's spreading so quickly and it caused a few deaths, right? This forces widespread panic to envelop the state of Utah. You have public gatherings that were canceled, including church meetings, public schools, universities, theaters, movie theaters, pool halls, dance halls, basically any public meeting of any kind, right? And you're thinking to yourself, my gosh, this is just like COVID. Well, yeah, that's the reason why there were so many historical parallels between this and COVID when the COVID-19 pandemic was happening. So by October 18th, you have about 100 new cases that were reported every day. And by the end of October, there were 2,400 cases that were reported with about 130 deaths. And that was according to the Salt Lake Tribune. Now in Utah, the ultimate death toll was about 2,343. Those deaths went from anywhere from September 1918 to June of 1919, or about 4% of those who contracted the disease. And then by 1919, the state actually had the second highest death rate of any state in the Union. Let me show you guys a quick video that explains this a little bit more detail.
The Spanish influenza epidemic began in the spring of 1918. It occurred in 3 waves. The first was an outbreak that began in some training camps in Kansas and Georgia, spread to Europe. The second was in the fall of 1918, which was the most lethal. And the third was the fall of 1919.
As soldiers at the Western Front in Europe are starting to get ill with the flu, there are rules of military censorship that basically silence that so that most people in the home countries don't know about it. This is because they're afraid of letting the other side know that their soldiers are sick.
The Great Flu Pandemic of 1918-1919 became known as the Spanish flu because the Spanish were neutral, so they didn't have the same censorship. They report about it in the newspapers in Spain, and people go, oh, look, there's a flu in Spain. Must be a Spanish flu. And that's why we call it the Spanish flu. It has nothing to do with its origins.
It might seem like a coincidence that a global pandemic of influenza happens at the same time as the First World War. But in fact, they're related. This is a time when you have tons of people living in close quarters together, particularly those who are serving in the military. You have shortages of food and good housing that mean that people are just not as healthy as they might otherwise be. And you have millions of people moving back and forth across their own countries, across the Atlantic. This is a perfect storm for the explosion of the flu into a global crisis.
The flu epidemic spread rapidly. Soldiers died on ships going to Europe to fight the war. They died in labor camps and frontline camps where they were all crowded in together.
The fall of 1918 is this crucial sort of moment of battle between the Allies and the Central Powers, and both sides of the war are being hit and hit hard by the flu. Wilson knows that he still needs to keep sending thousands and thousands of soldiers to France if the United States is going to win this war. He also knows many of the men he puts on those ships will die of the flu before they get to Europe. He makes that fateful decision to keep loading the ships. That is a difficult decision for him and a devastating one for many of the men who boarded those ships.
There is very little understanding of just how vast this epidemic is. It is, we think, the biggest plague in the history of the world, bigger than the Black Plague. We don't even think of it as affecting economies, affecting the output of agriculture, all of these different aspects. But in some areas, it really cut to the bone. The United States actually loses about 600,000 or 700,000 people. And the people who are the most affected are relatively young. They're men and women between the ages of 20 and 40. The people who die are at the prime of their productive lives. It's going to have a huge effect on the military, and it's going to have a huge effect in densely populated regions of the earth.
The country it hits the worst is India, where you have large populations crowded together. And in some respects, the greatest war in history to that time will lead to the greatest pandemic of these people who have been weakened, fighting the war, and are therefore more subject to falling prey to the flu. In the end, the flu pandemic kills twice as many people as the First World War does.
There are many tragic stories connected to the Spanish influenza epidemic. For example, there was a soldier by the name of Edwin Frick, and he had served overseas in an artillery unit. He had been in and out of the hospital with trench foot. The war's over. He's getting ready to go home in the winter of 1919 when he contracts Spanish influenza. He recovers and he writes to his parents and says, "The next letter that you get from me will be one when I am back in the good old USA." But in fact, the next letter that his parents get is from the hospital telling them that he was readmitted with a second bout of flu and has died. These were in some ways, for many Americans, the most tragic stories. People who had lived through the war only to die of Spanish influenza.
I get very angry at other historians who say there were those who were killed in action and then those who died of the flu. Come on, people. They would not have died of the flu if the war hadn't taken place. Those diseases were transmitted because of the density of men working closely together in bad conditions. And it's unfair to the memory of those men and women who died of the flu to think that, oh, well, that's not part of the war. Of course it's part of the war.
So again, you really can't talk about World War I without also mentioning the Spanish influenza, right? It really was a part, kind of almost a continuation of just the carnage and destruction and the death, the constant death that was inflicting the world, right? Hence why this can be considered a world war. Okay, continuing on. So, couple things happen, right? So now I talked about the influence of pandemic. Another thing happening as well is by after World War I, you have many African American soldiers who had actually served in the war, and had also had found an opportunity to be able to participate more in the economy, right? The United States had so many men going to serve overseas. They had this great migration beginning to happen where you had many African Americans in the South beginning to migrate north, right? This is considered one of the great human migrations in history. You have millions of African Americans who leave the South and leave sharecropping and leave the restrictive Jim Crow system and go to live in northern cities, right? And there's a reason why there's such a prominent Black neighborhoods and Black culture in places like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, right? So you have war industries, they motivated many Blacks to seek economic opportunities, right, in these northern industrial cities. And right, and what happens, especially in the 1920s, you see this renaissance of African-American culture through art and music beginning to happen. And you also have activism beginning to come about as well, right? Many people kind of got a taste and said, you know, we were on over to make the world safe for democracy, but what we found was that the French were more receptive of us as a people than our fellow Americans, right? We had more rights in France fighting a war there than we did here in the United States. And so you see a rise in activism beginning to happen, right? And you have the creation of these Black activist groups, right? You have the NAACP. You also have Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA. So the UNIA initially was started to mobilize Black workers in Harlem, but eventually it spread to other cities with about 4 million supporters. So Marcus Garvey, he's kind of at the forefront of this idea of Black separatism, right? Very, very different from other Black intellectuals prior to this who are more concerned with like assimilation. Booker T. Washington's a really excellent example of that, who really was a strong proponent of Black assimilation and Blacks becoming true Americans through education. But with the rise of Black activism, you also see a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, don't think I didn't forget, because I remember I had I think I had Newton asking me, what does James A. Garfield mean? And this literally just came to my mind. So the A actually stands for Abram. Now, what does Ku Klux Klan mean? And no, don't worry, I don't have the FBI on me, like knocking on my door, at least not yet. You know, we'll see what happens. But the Ku Klux Klan, it's actually really interesting. There's some debate about how they got the name, right? So the first iteration of the Klan came about. The first iteration of the Klan came about in the from 1865 to 1871, and then the second iteration of the Klan came about during this time, specifically really beginning in the 1920s. Well, I should really truly I'd say actually in 1915, with the film The Birth of a Nation being released, which was actually aired in the White House, right? So it was founded by 1915 by a man named William Joseph Simmons at Stone Mountain in near Atlanta, with 15 charter members, right? Its growth was based on a new kind of anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, prohibitionist, anti-Semitic agenda. And again, all of this reflected contemporary social tensions that existed in the United States, particularly because of recent immigration. So the new organization chapters, they adopted regalia that were featured in the film The Birth of a Nation, right? And membership was kept secret by the wearing of masks in public, right? So you see a huge growth really begin to happen after World War I, in response to this black activism that comes about. So you have blacks, Jews, Catholics, like they're all targets, and you begin to see the KKK really beginning to wield political power through the support of candidates. Another thing I kind of mentioned in another video as well. One of the videos I showed you is that there's this huge spike in a fear of communism, because you have these subversive groups who like immigrant groups who support communism at this time. So you have what's called the Red Scare, right? There were several bombs that were sent through the mail to public officials, both local and national, at this time. And these were people who were anarchists who wanted to start a communist revolution. And so you have sparking of raids. They were called the Palmer raids. Who was the Attorney General under Wilson, but this sparks the raids of many immigrant communities, primarily Eastern European and Russian. And then eventually in 1924, this culminates with the National Origins Act, right? You have 2% of the baseline population in 1890. That is the amount of immigrants who can come in, right? And that's primarily going to come from white European nations. And so mostly Eastern and Southern European immigrants arrived after that date. You don't have hardly any immigrants from Asia. And I just realized I still have not told you how the Ku Klux Klan got their name. Okay, so bear with me here. It was probably formed by combining the Greek kyklos, which basically means circle, with clan. Right, so the word had actually been previously used by other fraternal organizations in the South, such as Ku Klux Adelphon, right? So again, not very interesting, right? Kind of weird, but that is essentially where the name comes from. It comes from the Greek word circle and clan. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, but as I said before, if you look at the map here, right, notice the increase from earlier immigration, right, primarily comes from Eastern and Western Europe, and then shifts from to Southern and Eastern Europe, right? So the tensions that were caused by ethnic and religious differences, mostly immigrants. You had immigrants who were Catholic, where they were also Orthodox Christians. That caused a lot of tensions with American Protestants. Hence, you see a rise in the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan, right? And then finally, you have an economic recession that comes about due to overexpansion, also overproduction during and after the war. It's a big reason why the Republicans are swept into power in 1918 and 1920. You have high veteran unemployment that happens. You also have Western industries such as timbering, mining, and agriculture, and many of these struggle to recover even through the Great Depression. None of them ever really recover even up until the Great Depression at this time. And so you have Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, right? They campaign on this idea of return to normalcy because there was so much contention and chaos. You had so much violence in the United States. There were lynchings in the South. There was Red Scare. You had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. There were strikes. There was high unemployment, right? So there was a return to normalcy. You have the Spanish influenza, right? This is an incredibly chaotic time in American history. The end of the 19 teens is considered a kind of a dark period for many Americans, right? And so Warren Harding campaigns on this idea of a return to normalcy, right? We're going to go back to the way things were, go back to being isolationist, right? Back to the status quo. And then, you know, he's president until 1923. He dies, and then Calvin Coolidge becomes president after him. All right, that is everything that I have for you guys. Thank you guys for sticking with me. Hopefully you found today's lesson interesting. Again, as a reminder, please turn in your papers, analytical writing assignment number 4. Please turn those in so that I can have those sent to me. And then please make sure you read chapters 20 and 21 from the textbook. And then next time the quiz is going to be on chapters 17, 18, and 19. Okay, take care, guys. Have a good day, and I'll see you guys when I see you guys. Thank you.